and my talk's in 4 parts. So where we are now and how we got here, where we got here, where we are now, some thoughts on some of the key themes that are possibly universal across the UK, and then some comments on some bigger challenges. So first of all, some of the kind of issues, this title slide is a picture of Parliament House in Edinburgh, which was the Parliament built in 1640 for the Scottish Parliament. And typical of one of the kind of issues that's around in Scotland, this is formally, legally, common good property dating back to the 13th century. The law dates back to the 13th century. And recently I discovered that the City of Edinburgh Council, who are responsible for this asset, had written a letter in 2006 to the Scottish Government saying they had no interest in it. The Scottish Government was doing a big modernisation of the courts complex. And title disappeared, and this was discovered. And the council apparently had forgotten that it owned it. So these are the kind of issues that we're beginning to get into in Scotland. If you want to learn more about the kind of historic background, I recommend my book. New edition will be out in a couple of months' time. But this was an attempt back in 2010, aware that the land reform agenda in Scotland had sort of shuddered to a bit of a halt, aware that it would pick up again, and aware also that in order to engage with this debate and make it meaningful, people needed to be better informed about the history and context for this. I just want to give you one example of why this matters kind of historically in an enduring way. I studied Aberdeen University longer ago than I care to remember. But one of the interesting things I encountered there was the land question. And I got to know this lady in the top right. It was called Jean Bain. And she lived in a small farm just above Balmoral Castle, looking across to Loch Nagar in Deeside. And what was interesting about Jean was she was the last native speaker of Deeside Gaelic. So Gaelic wasn't spoken much in the east of Scotland across the Cairngorms. She was the last native speaker. And she died in 1994. And so with her went a totally unique dialect of Gaelic. And the main reason was only one person left speaking that language is because of the history of land tenure in this part of Scotland. In the 1880s, when an act was passed to give peasants security of tenure, they restricted it to 7 counties in the north and west of Scotland, and Aberdeenshire was not within its scope. So very, very slowly, all the people in Aberdeenshire, all the small farmers in Aberdeenshire, slowly disappeared. And she was the last one in Upper Deeside, and then the estate sold the house for a residential development opportunity that's been bought by someone in London. So the kind of impact of legal reforms, or lack of them, some century or more back, has ongoing impacts on life today. Now, of course, land was a big political topic in the past, in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Lloyd George, Churchill, the People's Budget saw heightened political interest in the land question. It led, very interestingly, I don't know if you can kill these lights, can you, just to get a bit of more saturation on the pictures. Incidentally, to the first comprehensive map-based survey of land in the whole of Britain and Ireland. This was conducted from 1910 to 1914, and with paper and pen and ink, Inland Revenue Commissioners went around the whole of Great Britain and Ireland, mapping every single house, farm, croft, inn, pub, and noting its ownership, its occupation, its value, etc. And of course, post-war, there was big developments in things like city gardens. Post-war planning legislation led to much greater public involvement in land allocation. The Land, Town and Country Planning Act, containing provisions to capture land uplift, etc. Much of these civic-minded interventions were abandoned by the 1950s, by which time agriculture was also intensifying. There were agricultural subsidies being brought in, agricultural tax breaks, increasingly pushing up the price of land. And then in the 1970s, in Scotland, we began to get interested in the land question again. John McEwan wrote a book on who owns Scotland to try and put it into the political agenda. My own book of the same name came out in 1996. And in the 1990s, land became political again as communities in places like the island of Egg started to mount campaigns to take over the ownership of land from absentee landowners. This is the chairman of the Ascent Crofters Trust who managed to buy this from a bankrupt Swedish bank back in 1994. And this whole movement in the Highlands, not in the rest of Scotland, has been well documented in a book by James Hunter, which I commend to you. Now, the Scottish Parliament's been critical in all of this because, as I argued in 1996, we can't have a proper legal reform until we have a legislature able to do that. Westminster couldn't do this because the Secretary of State for Scotland only got about 2 or 3 slots in the Westminster timetable for Scottish legislation, because Scotland's a completely separate jurisdiction, so all laws are distinctive. 2 or 3 slots a year is not enough slots to do legal reform of feudalism and things. So these bills were never put forward in Parliament. And also there was the whole problem of the House of Lords, full of hereditary peers who would typically talk out anything that affected their northern playgrounds. So 97 saw the development, saw Tony Blair, the Scottish Parliament was established, and a land reform policy group was set up, chaired by Lord Sewell, reported in 99 with a whole swathe of land reform, land law recommendations for the first session of the Scottish Parliament to pick up on. And then just in time to kind of make this a politically salient event, in 2000, a huge mountain range in the Isle of Skye, the Cuillin, Black Cuillin, were put on the market for sale of offers over £10 million. This kind of shocked people, and people didn't realise that actually mountains could be sold, which is a bit bizarre because of course they can. But it raised a whole question about whether in fact John MacLeod of MacLeod here actually did own them. He wanted to sell them because he had a castle with a flat roof that leaked, and he wanted to repair it, so he decided to sell the Cuillins. The interesting thing about John MacLeod, of course, was his titles date way back from 1611, and so a lot of us raised questions as to whether in fact he actually owned the Cuillins. It was a fantastic tale. Ended up never ever selling them, of course, but it kind of put the issue of kind of land, one of the cases that put the issue of land firmly in the public spotlight, that was just the advert from Savills to sell the mountains, etc. So Parliament then proceeded to pass a whole load of acts, the introduction of national parks in Scotland, which, you know, in 1947 when they came to England and Wales, the landed class blocked them in Scotland in the House of Lords. Abolition of feudal tenure, about 300 years after the rest of Europe. Leasehold casualties, Land Reform Scotland Act, which gave communities rights to buy agricultural holdings, which reformed agricultural tenure, title conditions, which was about burdens and have. That's a whole suite of things. And so what I want to stress about the emergence of the contemporary land reform agenda in Scotland is that it was as much about democratic renewal as it was about land reform. Land reform was something that simply hitched on the back of a process of democratic renewal. Now, 15 years on, from 1999, land reform is once again to the fore after a bit of a hiatus since 2005. We'll talk about why that is if you want. And part of the fact that it's back on the agenda is due to the fact that there are ongoing issues that continue to emphasise the importance and continuing relevance of land. So, for example, I mentioned common good land. I co-authored a report back in 2005 looking at this very old form of common land in Scotland's royal boroughs, 196 royal boroughs. Been neglected as a topic. People around Scotland in Ayr and Kilmarnock and Cooper and places were beginning to raise questions about what local councils were doing with bits of land, slowly recovering a sense that this belonged to them historically, not quite sure what the law said and all that kind of thing. Very important historically in places like St Andrews. On the left here, its common land was the Pilmuir Links, which of course are where historically and today the famous golf course exists. Scotland suffered rampant municipal corruption and nepotism for about 300 years, from 1490 to 1833 Borough Reform Act, because councils ceased to have elections back in 1490, and councils were simply selected by the old council. So the old council just met and selected the new one, selected the officers. And this led to lots of corruption and the parallel process in England as well, leading up to 1833 borough reform. But as a result of some of this corruption and nepotism, many boroughs, including Edinburgh, actually went bankrupt. St Andrews went bankrupt in the late 18th century, and part of the response to that was to sell off, or rather lease, the Pilmuir Links to a rabbit farmer. Then we had 20 years of what were called the Rabbit Wars, as the golfers, of course, the people of St Andrews had historic rights to play, and you know nobody could take those away. But of course, they were increasingly playing over a piece of land that was used as a rabbit warren And so the 18-hole golf courses turned into 50-hole golf courses. New bunkers appeared. Etchings like this were done, and it went to the House of Lords, and there was questions in Parliament and all the rest of it. So this is none of these issues are new. All of these issues are of long standing. Then in 2011, the SNP had a manifesto commitment to review earlier Scottish Parliament legislation, and following their election, this developed into a much more fundamental review carried out by the Land Reform Review Group, whose 270-page report is well worth reading, I think, although it relates specifically to Scotland. A lot of these issues here about housing, urban renewal, community acquisition, community development, national forest estate, crown property rights, public land, inheritance, tenant farming, land taxation, are all relevant issues across the UK. So despite, as I say, its relevance just to the Scottish jurisdiction, I would recommend dipping into that for perhaps some inspiration. At the same time, also the Scottish Affairs Committee in the House of Commons was looking at land reform, principally looking at fiscal dimensions of land, things like heritage tax exemptions that people get to deferment of inheritance tax in exchange for keeping land available. All sorts of interesting stuff coming out of the National Audit Office at that time about tax reliefs, including things like the exemption of gains on disposal of main residence. That's the capital gains tax relief that people have on their principal houses. £10.4 billion a year. It's now costing over £13 billion a year, highlighting some of that. Agricultural property relief is exempt from inheritance tax due to some law in the 1930s to protect family farms. Of course, it's now used as a tax device by people like James Dyson, who bought 17,000 acres of farmland and is now able to avoid inheritance tax because it's agriculture. Then the next big sort of kick on this process was the independence referendum. That, aside from the issues of yes and no, that galvanised political activity in Scotland. Suddenly people were meeting in pubs and their homes and town halls and places, thinking and discussing matters of political import. And they weren't just to do with independence, they were actually to do with, well, what would we do with the powers of independence? And one of these topics inevitably was land. So what has been developing, I think, in the last few years is what I would describe as land literacy, increasing understanding and comprehension of the role that land plays in every aspect of life, fiscally, legally, in policy and administrative terms. And this is very, very important. So the arguments are being played out in august journals like the Scottish Field, which is a kind of magazine for the country set. This whole process is still in its infancy, I would stress, but perhaps the key message is that the genie is out of the bottle and land is back on the political agenda. So today the debate on land in Scotland is not only more mature, but it's also much, much more wide-ranging. So it's covering issues to do with land information and registration, rights and responsibilities, governments adopting statements, political statements, mandating Parliament to have statements on the importance of land, land taxes, laws on hunting, inheritance, community rights in land, compulsory purchase being reviewed, whole issue around the Crown estate being devolved in the new Scotland Bill, control over the seabed and the foreshore, regeneration and housing, community empowerment bill being debated next week at stage 3, contains lots and lots of stuff on allotments and various community rights, agricultural holdings legislation, fisheries, stuff on offshore companies, the list goes on. There's a whole lot of stuff being talked about just now. I'm a member of the Commission on Local Tax Reform, so we are reforming the council tax in Scotland, a highly regressive tax, and trying to come up with something that's fairer. Housing, there's issues, there's a whole private rented sector reform going on to tenancies and further work on how to expand affordable housing. Just yesterday, Shelter launched a huge report called Housing and Wellbeing, talking about issues around tax, for example. So there's a lot of stuff happening, and I would certainly commend you kind of dip in and try and get a sense of what's going on, because I think Scotland is kind of like in the poll tax today, is a bit of a kind of a test bed for some of these things. And I certainly, in conversation with colleagues down south, I'm keen to try and exchange intelligence. Now, in the rest of the UK, I won't say much about it because I'm not too familiar with it, but I do note a growing awareness, as exemplified by this workshop to take land matters more seriously. Financial Times leader in April 2015 is now talking about measures needed, land value taxation, green policy, compulsory purchase of land, digging up David Lloyd George and Winston Churchill. This is becoming a mainstream part of the economic discourse, and part of this is in the aftermath of the financial crash, which of course was partly caused by the subprime lending problem in the USA, which in effect was a Ponzi scheme on land, which washed over to Ireland. This is George Osborne back in 2006 telling the Irish that they stand as a shining example of the art of possible and long-term economic policy making, 2 years before one of the worst crashes the world has seen, so the economy is safe in his hands. This is how the Financial Times described it at the time, sort of northern, at the height of the lunacy, 3/4 of the total lending by Irish banks, 420 billion got tied up in property construction and land speculation, sort of northern rock on steroids. Very interesting little piece from the Bartlett School in London, just published yesterday, the day before, 5 radical ideas for a better planning system. One of these was all about land. So to conclude, we need to develop what I call land literacy. This is a long and slow process, but it's not hard. We need to have an ability, a far better ability to understand the role that land plays in policies, legislation and administrative decisions that are taken every day. For example, in the UK we have what are called non-recourse, we have recourse loans when you take out a mortgage to buy a house, which means that the bank takes security over your property, and if you default on that they can pursue you for, I think in England, 12 years, in Scotland it's 20 years. Now that's very different in the USA where they have non-recourse loans. If you buy a house for $200,000 and it crashes and halves in value to $100,000, the bank security is the house itself and that's all it gets. So it takes much of the risk, you can hand the keys in and walk away. So issues like that we hardly talk about, but they're intrinsic to for example, the whole question of land and securities and debt and what that does to personal or private individuals. Issues to do with the powers of the Crown Estate Commissioners, things we hardly ever explore, but in Scotland we began to take a detailed look at that. Community land rights, which are far more extensive than perhaps some of us think, the impact of land, how land is taxed, things like this. And finally, at the end of the day, this is all about the place you call home and where you are. This is a slide of the middle of Linwood in Renfrewshire, where the Linwood car plant was built in the 60s to build the Hillman Imp, etc. Big expansion, but the town centre's now gone into decline. It's a long story, but one of the stories here was that the lease was taken by a secretive company who it turned out at the end of the day were acting as a front company for Tesco, who came in and took over the whole of the town centre and nobody knew about it. So these land issues are at the heart of communities. And finally, I grew up in a small town called Kinross, and when I was a very young boy, we used to go to the town hall here, which was built by the people of Kinross, and the Carnegie Library next door, and have folk festivals and dances and flower shows and all the rest of it. With the 1973 Local Government Reform Act, with the abolition of town councils in Scotland, 196 local councils were wound up and dissolved. This is a picture of Kinross Town Hall 5 years ago, lying empty, derelict, boarded up and riddled with dry rot. And in a sense that's an allegory for where we are with land. We've lost control, we've lost our sense of place, and the kind of institutions that used to be at the heart of land governance now lie a little bit kind of rotten and unloved. So, thank you, and we've got 10-15 minutes for questions, I think.